Tonight on Nova, we continue a major series unlocking the mysteries of science in China. It's a tale of triumph, defeat, and the struggle to regain past glory. Journey deep inside these ancient walls in search of the genius that was China. This time, the scientific revolution transformed Europe, but the inventions it spurred looked like toys to the Chinese. It was a critical mistake, as Europe's restless expansion produced empires in collision.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
Astronomical instruments on Beijing's city wall. Built by the Jesuits some 350 years ago, part of their ambitious and subtle plan to convert the Chinese Empire to Christianity. The Jesuits came to Asia early in the 16th century, the vanguard of a worldwide missionary effort launched by the Catholic Church. St. Francis Xavier founded the Jesuit mission to the East and dedicated his life to converting Asian peoples, but his eyes were always on the largest prize, China. To persuade the Chinese of the superiority of Western religion, Xavier's Jesuit followers brought with them not just the Bible, but the latest advances of Western science and mathematics, embodied in these astronomical instruments. By impressing the Emperor of China with their scientific knowledge, the priests hoped to persuade him to accept the word of God as well. The Jesuit mission confronted a vision of the world very different from that of the West. The European drive for discovery faced a China convinced of its own accomplishments and power. For the next 300 years, Europe knocked on China's door, and China's persistent rejection of Western ideas and advances led first to conflict and then ultimately to disaster for the Celestial Empire. In 1600, when these events began to unfold, China was rich, powerful, and very stable indeed. China's economy, equal to that of all Europe, was completely self-sufficient. Water power was used to drive its great industries. Chinese porcelain wares were unequaled anywhere in the world. Silk, produced on these complex draw looms, had provided an exotic luxury for the West since Roman times. Metallurgy and its application to agriculture had been mastered for more than 1,500 years. And China's rich mud supported the world's most productive system of farming. The maintenance of the complex system of waterways and public works that made the system function was the empire's highest priority. To manage this sophisticated and powerful empire, the Chinese had developed an effective and resilient form of government. Officials gained office by merit through examinations, not by birth, as was the case in feudal Europe. These bureaucrats and the emperor himself derived their values from the teachings of Confucius.
The Chinese state concentrated on training scholars in Confucianism who, having grasped all the principles of good government and harmonious societies, then were placed in key positions throughout the country, provinces, county, down to the county level. And through them, they could guide the whole population, offer the main principles of government to everyone, and the rest of it you can leave to the families. Confucianism was based on the Chinese family, and in the course of 1,000 years, the Confucians became the sole source of all wisdom for state manipulation is too strong a word, but a state way of guiding the way of life of all Chinese.
Confucian ideology valued agriculture over all other forms of economic activity. Merchants were relegated to the bottom of the social order, and economic growth as the aim of commerce was disdained. In the early 16th century, Chinese merchants were forbidden to go abroad, and the empire was isolated behind its ancient fortified boundaries. It was this isolation that the Jesuits of the China mission sought to breach. Confined to the tiny peninsula of Macau near Canton, the priests built this church of St. Paul's in the late 16th century. But for decades, no priests were allowed into the Chinese mainland.
It was impossible. They were not admitted at all. Then came Father Alexander Valignano in 1579, visitor of all Jesuits in the East. And every morning, after getting up from bed, you open the window of the College of St. Paul, looking at the China, you will say, "When will thou be open, O rock? When will thou be open, O rock? When will thou be open, O rock?"
It was Father Matteo Ricci who finally opened the rock. Ricci recognized immediately, in ways many of his co-religionists did not, that Chinese civilization was genuinely impressive. Inherent in the drive to convert the heathen is the idea that Christian culture is superior. Ricci had the genius to understand how extraordinary that claim must have seemed to the Chinese. In fact, Ricci's first attempts to present his case to the Chinese, dressed as he was in drab priestly robes, were a complete failure.
And then it changed, knowing that the scholars in China were very well appreciated and loved by the people. He dressed like a scholar, a very nice habit, and then a very nice hat, and then he was accepted by the Chinese community.
Ricci realized that to have any real impact on China, he would have to come here, the center of imperial power, Beijing's forbidden city. Unfortunately, it was off limits to foreigners, but an unusual gift was to open the doors to the empire's inner sanctum. Ricci's passport to Beijing was the clock, the European version of the mechanical clock, unknown in China. European craftsmen had recently learned how to miniaturize these devices, and the Jesuits gave these as gifts to many Chinese officials to ease their passage to the capital. Upon his arrival in Beijing in 1600, Ricci used the clock to represent all the scientific and technological advances which his Christian culture could offer the Chinese. Ricci's clocks were highly prized by the Chinese, yet almost 5 centuries earlier, the Chinese had built their own clocks for use as astronomical measuring devices. This was part of the great flowering of scientific discovery in China that also included the inventions of gunpowder weapons and the maritime compass. But the Chinese water clocks, huge and unwieldy at the best of times, were not accurate enough to improve Chinese astronomical measurements. So, while astronomy remained an essential concern, clockmaking did not. By the time Ricci arrived in China, even the memory of Chinese clockmaking had been lost. Astronomy was crucial to the Chinese because they believed that there was a direct connection between the events in the night sky and events on Earth. Astronomical observations would reveal how well or badly the ruler and his bureaucrats were governing. Ricci and his successor, Adam Schall, sought to capitalize on this interest. Schall even entered the imperial bureaucracy, rising to the directorship of the Department of Astronomy after predicting an eclipse more accurately than the Chinese. The Jesuits drew these plans for a new astronomical observatory that they later set up on Beijing's city wall. Yet the Jesuit mission ended in failure. The Emperor Kangxi accepted both clocks and astronomy, but drastically curtailed Jesuit missionary efforts in 1705. And in 1770, the Pope disbanded the Jesuit order. Kangxi may have used their ideas, but he dismissed the Jesuits' fundamental claim of superiority. There is little about their methods that is new, he wrote. Western methods all derive from Chinese. But Kangxi was wrong, for in Europe, truly new scientific ideas were overturning the old order. In time, they would jolt China, too. The transformation began, innocently enough, with a novel attempt to analyze the motions of the heavens. In 1543, Nicolae Copernicus published his radical thesis that the Earth moved around the sun. Galileo, 50 years later, built on the Copernican revolution with a whole new approach to science, the idea of the systematic experiment. Galileo was one of the first professional scientists. He and his successors pursued their scientific studies within powerful institutions like Britain's Royal Society, established by King Charles II in 1663. One early president of the Royal Society was Sir Isaac Newton. Newton's central accomplishment was to demonstrate that all of nature could be described in mathematical terms, that anything from the fall of the apple to the motion of the planets obeyed certain universal laws. Reason, logic, deduction could uncover the secrets of nature. The combination of his new mathematics and his powerful position allowed Newton to begin to build a bridge between science and practical problems. the Royal Society began to welcome an influential group of men, the great instrument makers of England.
The instrument makers, of course, had already formed an important trade in 17th century England, but the revelation of the Newtonian worldview gave them, in a sense, a new status. It gave mathematics a new status within science, and therefore it gave the mathematical instrument maker a new edge, if you like. It was particularly significant that they could become Fellows of the Royal Society and achieved an unprecedented status in the scientific community of the time. And this gave these makers an identity with the scientific enterprise. They got to know the scientists within the society, they got to understand their concerns and their needs, and it helped them to develop the kind of instruments that the natural philosophers or scientists were actually in need of.
The instrument makers enabled scientists to quantify their observations. This new vision of the world, bound together by mathematics, is what the Europeans tried and failed to impress upon the Chinese. In their great library at Beijing, the Jesuits translated Western books of science and engineering. The drawings in them used the new mathematics of projective geometry to reproduce on a two-dimensional sheet of paper the three-dimensional workings of a machine. Any craftsman trained to read a diagram could build a pump from a drawing that laid out each component with such precision. The Chinese lacked the mathematics of perspective drawing and were slow to acquire it from the West. For all their accomplishments, the Chinese remained committed to their traditional views of nature, billowing clouds and all.
One-point perspective is a perfectly good way of looking at the world. It's a highly rational one. It was a part of the commitment to rationality above all that we think of as the scientific revolution. The Chinese way of looking at things was equally natural, but it wasn't entirely rational. It valued aesthetic experience as much as rational knowledge. It wasn't at all clear at the point where those two cultures diverged where the difference was going to lead them. But over several hundred years, we find that it led them in very different directions and led to enormous amounts of mutual incomprehension.
In Europe, in the early 1600s, Dutch merchants were applying new mathematical discoveries to the practical problems of building better ships. Design drawings using these new techniques of perspective revolutionized the construction of these ships. The Dutch built enormous vessels, like the Batavia, now being reconstructed in Holland from 17th century plans. Such ships were designed to make the arduous voyages to the Far East, and their mission was not to win souls like the Jesuits, but to grasp the riches of the trade with Asia. These mighty craft were a high point of Dutch technological achievement. At the naval shipyards of Zaandam, the Dutch were turning them out at a rate of 1 per week. Impressive as they were, these ships were simply one of many innovations by the Dutch.
Now, in the early 17th century, the rich merchants of Amsterdam created a whole host of commercial institutions which would have an impact on Europe well beyond that of simple technologies. These included many types, but foremost amongst them were the joint stock companies. Because you see, the joint stock company allowed the bringing together of small sums of wealth into the hands of the boards of directors of these companies in a promise for profits from shares. Okay? Now, because of this, you have a concentration of wealth at the point of production. And this financed the great trading and shipping ventures the marine insurance, the life insurance, the fire insurance, so necessary for merchant activity.
The wealthy Protestant merchants who ran these great trading companies dominated their societies. These are the directors of the Dutch East India Company. Their charter gave the company a monopoly on the trade with the East, along with the right to wage war and govern foreign territories. Driven by the power of these new economic institutions, the pace of trade with Asia picked up steadily across the 17th century. The European ships plied the waters between Canton and the North Sea, and a single shipload was worth as much as 3.5 million guilders, $500 million in today's dollars. Of all the goods those vessels carried, one was prized above all: Chinese porcelain. In Europe at this time, no craftsman could match the quality of the great wares of China. The Chinese may not have appreciated the value of Western mathematics, but their practical knowledge enabled them to develop the extraordinarily sophisticated techniques of porcelain manufacture. In ancient step kilns like these in Fujian, master potters had learned by careful observation to control temperatures at more than 1,000 degrees, creating ceramics of extraordinary strength and glazes of great beauty and refinement. This knowledge was passed down through families within the ancient traditions of China's craft guilds. The scale of this state-run industry was enormous. Yet by the 17th century, the European demand for porcelain produced at these kilns was growing at such a rate that even the largest factory could barely keep pace. And then, in the face of this growing demand, Chinese production was drastically cut back. In 1644, as this Chinese film recalls, the Manchus, nomadic tribes from the north, invaded China. They overthrew the Ming dynasty that had ruled for 300 years. For 3 decades, ordinary economic life was disrupted as the new Qing dynasty fought to gain control over the empire.
And this meant enormous internal turmoil in China, disrupting the whole economy, all its trade lines. And of course, this meant that European consumers no longer had access to Chinese products, particularly porcelain. And this gave an opportunity for European producers to jump into the gap, to fill the market space. In Delft, a town not far from Amsterdam, is a good example. The brewers, rich in wealth, decided to transfer their monies into the new avenues. And the combination of ingenuity, hard work, and a lot of money, they created Delftware, which was an imitation porcelain, blue and white, made out of clay, definitely an inferior product, but one that could make the grade just about. Soon, a third of the town were engaged in the production of what was a substitute. This meant that they were also involved in what can only really be called false advertising, because stamped upon the pottery were Chinese characters, obviously giving the impression that they came from China. So the Europeans had discovered, at a very early date, the commercial value of imitation and copying, long before the Japanese arrived on the scene in the early 20th century.
By the end of the 17th century, the Chinese resumed production, and Dutch traders grew rich, shipping both imitation and real china all over Europe. They never carried Delftware to China, though, for implicit within Chinese claims of self-sufficiency was the belief that Europe made nothing worth owning. The Asia trade was all one way. China sold and Europe bought, And that, however much Europeans wished otherwise, was that. Faced with this humiliating imbalance, some Europeans decided to beat the Chinese at their own game by learning how to make real porcelain. In 1723, the French Academy of Sciences set out to discover what porcelain was made of and how it was to be fired. So complete was the Chinese porcelain monopoly at this time that to accommodate European tastes and requirements, Western merchants began to commission their wares directly from the Chinese. The Chinese worked with specific mixtures of stone and minerals, and over the centuries had developed firing procedures that gave their Chinaware its unique properties. The Chinese sensibly refused to allow foreigners to come to porcelain production centers, so the French went in for a bit of industrial espionage.
As Jesuits were evangelizing in China, one of them, Father d'Entrecol, received an order from one of his superior in Paris, who happened to be related to a future minister of finance named Horry. He received the order to go to Qingdechen and to try to spy, how this paste was made, this porcelain was made. And he wrote 2 letters, one in 1712, the other one in 1724. This letter went together to France with samples and misunderstanding. The different ceramicists working in the French Academy of Science tried reading Entrecol's letter. They tried to produce porcelain that was like the Chinese porcelain. And they came eventually on something totally new, which had the same quality, but which was totally different, which we still called soft paste porcelain.
This was one of the first examples of what we now call applied scientific research. This and other developments helped spur the growth of the new French porcelain industry established at Sèvres, near Paris. In a gesture of extraordinary cheek, the French Minister for Trade even commissioned a sculpture of the Chinese emperor, taken from a Jesuit drawing and made with the soft paste porcelain. With this, he hoped to impress the emperor with the accomplishments of French industry and the desirability of its products. The statue was given to the emperor as one of the gifts carried by a trade mission from France to China. The Chinese were still not impressed. Nothing the French offered them seemed significant in the context of their own power and glory. Within the halls of the Forbidden City, Paris and its pretty trinkets remained far away indeed. For the Emperor of China, the most spectacular examples of European technology were only curiosities. Even these. Like the Jesuits before them, the French brought clocks as gifts for the emperor to swell a collection that eventually totaled over 2,000. To the Europeans, these instruments embodied the notion of the clockwork universe. The clock was the symbol of the triumph of science. In China, these were simply toys. In England, King Charles II set up the Royal Greenwich Observatory in 1675 to improve the navigational ability of British fleets. The observatory bought 2 giant pendulum clocks, which offered a first step toward a solution of one of the key navigational problems facing European mariners. But these clocks were both too big and too delicate to go to sea. Latitude, how far north or south one is, can be solved simply using trigonometry. But fixing longitude, how far east or west a ship may be, requires knowledge of the exact time, and hence the need for a clock that could keep good time at sea. It was the clockmaker John Harrison who came up with a solution: double-balanced pendulums, which he incorporated on his first marine chronometer. With several more such innovations, Harrison eventually won a prize of £20,000, over $1 million in today's currency. Parliament had established this award for anyone who could solve the longitude problem, an example of the way in which the state cultivated scientific talent to attack the practical problems of the day. Harrison was a working man, and while England was hardly egalitarian, Harrison's skills earned him access to the highest levels of the scientific establishment, and they gave British ships the key to travel the world round. Such a goal was hardly a Confucian priority, and this kind of official support for practical research remained foreign to China. At the European trading bases in the port of Canton, the clash of cultures continued 200 years after the Jesuits first landed. Still, despite any claims to technological superiority, European traders were simply buying from China with gold or silver, and the Chinese were purchasing nothing in exchange. What the Europeans wanted was more equal trade, and this they could not get.
It's very hard for the Manchu Qing government to appreciate what's it got to do with us. I mean, you want trade, fine, come along. We'll give you as much trade as we think you deserve. But what's all this about equality between states for trading purposes and so on? How can you be equal to us? We're a great empire. You are simply a bunch of merchants representing a king somewhere, far, far away, and mostly irrelevant to what we need. That's the sort of background. And in that background, for the Europeans to keep knocking again and again, demanding to be let in to trade on equal terms, seem almost insulting and certainly irrelevant to the main needs of the empire.
Yet while European innovations were irrelevant to China, here in the pottery centers of Staffordshire, England, competition with Chinese products in the home market drove British technology forward. The leading innovator was Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood was a scientific enthusiast, an amateur. He experimented with new materials and invented different ceramics. In order to do this, he needed to know the precise temperature of his kilns. Like all potters, Wedgwood realized that clay shrinks at a fairly consistent rate when heated. So he devised this calibrated pyrometer, which links the shrinkage of a cylinder of clay to the heat of the kiln. For this invention, Wedgwood was elected to the Royal Society in 1783, and using such precision instruments, he was able to produce his stunningly beautiful jasperware. The idea of a potter being admitted into the aristocracy of scientists would seem odd today, but it did not then, for this was the scientific revolution in action. Wedgwood and his contemporaries had learned Newton's lesson, that nature, even the production of fine pottery, was governed by laws, and that laws could be deduced by logic and experiment. But while men like Wedgwood pursued science, China retained its hold on the European imagination, offering an image of exotic romance, as in this picture of the emperor ritually plowing the first furrow of the year. In the great aristocratic houses of Europe, chinoiserie, the taste for Chinese art and design, was all the rage, and nowhere more spectacularly so than in the famous Chinese room at the Potsdam Palace in Dresden. At Woburn Abbey, rare Chinese deer still roam the grounds. And the Duke of Bedford, like many European aristocrats, even built his outbuildings, here at Derry, in the fashionable Chinese style. The Bedford family, in fact, was responsible for another import from China that was to have a major impact on English life.
In theory, it was the wife of the 7th Duke, Anna Maria, who invented this very English habit of taking tea in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. I suppose you had China tea. When did you drink it? She started to drink it in the afternoon, and that's where, in theory, the habit started from. Well, my family, I think, looking very much to a new form of business, to be involved in the business of the day, which one of them was the East India Company. And we married the granddaughter of the president of the East India Company, Sir Josiah Child. And as her dowry, she bought the shares in the East India Company and the shares in Child's Bank. And I think that's what suddenly got my ancestors keen in getting a little more commercial. And so they built 2 ships, and which obviously plied that trade. And as a result, I think also got those ships to bring the decorations that you see in this room and many others, and in particular the wallpaper that was made for the room in China in 1754. I think you had the opportunity not only to originate your own scenes, but also if you didn't think there was enough decoration on them, you could order from China extra butterflies or extra birds or extra flowers. I mean, it was a very forward marketing concept.
This love of decoration, of gaudy and magnificent toys, was characteristic of 18th century Europe. But these seemingly frivolous devices employed one of the most important technological developments of the 18th century, a clockwork mechanism for controlling complex movement. These gorgeous French mechanical dolls entertained aristocrats from the Palace of Versailles to the court of Beijing. The application of what was essentially a form of automation also drove the next phase of the Industrial Revolution, one that was to give European producers an ultimately unbeatable edge over their Chinese competitors. At Lyon, the center of the French silk industry, a group of innovative weavers applied this technology to manufacturing to make them more competitive with the Chinese. Weaving patterns into silk fabric was both labor-intensive and slow. A weaver named Jean-Marie Jacquard came up with these punch cards to automate the process. The traditional method of silk weaving had been invented in China over 1,000 years ago and involved 2 men working the loom. The master weaver controlled the movement of the shuttle. To create the pattern, the long warp threads were lifted by the drawboy. However, to change designs, he had to learn thousands of new moves. The Jacquard cards made it possible to replace the drawboy. The ultimate step was to harness a source of power that would supplant human strength as well as human skills. With the application of such power, it becomes possible to replace the weaver himself. The first step was to harness the driving power of water. In the early 1700s, water power began to transform what had been a cottage industry into the foundation of England's extraordinary wealth and power. In the beginning, Britain's water wheels drove spinning machines that produced the long, strong warp threads of the loom. This is a scale model of the Loam brothers' water-powered silk spinning machine. John Loam stole the plans for the machine from Italian silk makers. The Loam brothers installed their new devices in a small mill building near Derby in 1719, creating one of the first true factories of the industrial age. The Loam brothers weren't the first ones to exploit water power. The Chinese had made use of water-driven technology 400 years earlier. Water power was even used to automate the spinning of cotton in the 14th century. But water-driven machinery did not spark an industrial revolution in China as it would in Europe, a concrete expression of the different priorities the two cultures possessed. While Europe's economy was driven by the notion of expansion, China did not respond to the lure of unlimited economic growth.
What was much more important was clever methods being applied to increase productivity in agriculture. Then the state was in favor of that. But anything beyond that, the state really looked upon as being totally irrelevant. In its place, this emphasis upon harmony and on moral order and so on engaged all the best brains in the country. And some of these best brains in their spare time did a bit of science and technology, but it was also regarded as a hobby and something you can enjoy, but nothing to do with the needs of the state. So again, it comes back to the nature of a strong bureaucratic state, philosophically strengthened by Confucianism, and feeling that they don't need science and technology for what they want to do. They've got the answers already. And why would you want to increase productivity that much when we already have enough?
In Europe, there was never enough. The huge water-driven machines in British factories opened the era of mass production. This extraordinary leap in the amount of goods England was able to turn out each year was unheard of, stunning. Compared to the hardships of life on the land, the Industrial Revolution seemed to offer unlimited wealth, and this mastery over nature seemed to some the fulfillment of God's promise to man. The Protestant work ethic was to play as important a role in legitimizing the values of the Industrial Revolution as Confucian concerns did in reinforcing the agrarian values of China. In practical terms, of course, the Industrial Revolution had profound human costs. Spinners and weavers in Britain had been independent craftsmen and women, working on their own machines in their own cottages. No more. The new factories transformed these independent contractors into wage laborers. The clock, rather than the pace of the seasons, governed their working lives. And the notion of the clockwork universe envisioned by Isaac Newton's successors expanded in the hands of the new industrialists to include human beings as well as the planets.
And you began to get mill-owner philosophers whose most advanced exponent was a man called Dr. Andrew Ure, who published a book called The Philosophy of Manufactures in 1835. who had this picture of a mill being a working automata in which the people were only sort of little bits and cogs of the whole great machine, and the object of the whole process was to make the humans as like pieces of machinery as possible. That also meant they had to be internally habituated to the measurement of work out in this way. In this sense, you can see some of the features which some of the religious beliefs, particularly Methodism, took in this period as being part of the internalization of the new work discipline of the factory and the mill system.
For all its attendant human costs, the system worked. After spinning was mechanized, the loom was next. Water power drove the spinning machines, but a new invention, the steam engine, would power the great looms of Britain and transform not just England's economy, but that of the world as well. Cotton from the New World and the colonies in India flowed into England to be spun and woven into thread and cloth. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, the English textile industry was the largest and most productive the world had ever known. English textiles were traded around the world, even back to America and to India. But not to China. China maintained its traditional policy. It was willing to sell to European merchants, but not willing to buy from them. In 1793, King George III made one more attempt to crack the China market by negotiation. He sent Lord Macartney, loaded down with obligatory gifts, to try to persuade the Emperor Qianlong to permit Britain to sell its industrial goods in China. In keeping with time-honored customs, the British even brought the Emperor yet more clockwork. Despite this, Macartney failed. Qianlong said, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in abundance and lack no product within our borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactured goods of outside barbarians in exchange for our products." Qianlong died before the consequences of his decision came home to roost, never realizing that the British possessed a technology that could multiply the strength of their 10 millions to match that of 350 million Chinese. The British Industrial Revolution began with factories and water power, but it reached its height with the harnessing for the first time of chemical energy, steam engines, driven by coal fires. James Watt's steam engine was the culmination of both the scientific and industrial revolutions. It was one of the first practical applications of the principles of thermodynamics, and it could deliver a steady flow of power to any machine to which it was attached. Watt's engine provided the first power source steady enough to drive the great looms of industrial Britain. And the virtually unlimited nature of steam power drove the construction of ever larger factories. Women and children, cheaper and more nimble than men, were drawn into the labor force. The extraordinary potential of steam transformed Britain as no technology had before. And unlike water power, steam was portable. It could move. George Stephenson and his son Robert helped launch the railroads when their rocket locomotive reached the fantastic speed of 18 miles per hour at the 1829 trials of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. The steam engine went to sea as well, freeing ships from the whims of wind and tide. Now the power of steam would carry the British to Asia in ever-increasing numbers. There was another technology that had a transforming effect on Britain in the first part of the 19th century, the production of ever higher quality iron and later of steel. The Derby family of Colebrookdale, England, came up with the techniques to produce cast iron cheaply, with the result that the face of Britain literally began to change. The Darbys constructed this magnificent structure over the River Severn, the world's first all-iron bridge. Cast iron had another use as well. The high quality of iron, available in great quantities, enabled the British to mass-produce ever more powerful cannon. With steam and modern weapons, the British now possessed an absolute military edge over the Chinese. But opium was the catalyst for conflict. The resin from the white opium poppy was a commonly used ingredient in the herbal compounds of Eastern medicine. But the extract of the poppy, administered in regular doses, was fiercely addictive, as the British discovered. The British East India Company took over local opium production and expanded it to industrial scale at their factories in Bengal. Opium proved to be the only product that the Chinese would purchase from the West, and they did so in such quantities that by the 1830s the Chinese paid out more silver for opium than all their exports brought in. The social impact was appalling. Corrupt officials turned a blind eye as the economy was drained. In 1839, the emperor sent an incorruptible official, Commissioner Lin, to stop the trade. Lin wrote to Queen Victoria saying, "Let us ask, where is your conscience? How can you bear to go further selling products injurious to others in order to fulfill your own insatiable desire?" Receiving no reply, Lin destroyed 21,000 chests of opium seized in Canton. As this Chinese feature film dramatizes, the British response was immediate. The First Opium War had begun. British gunboats equipped with the new technology born of the Industrial Revolution moved inexorably up the Yangtze River. The modern British cannon far superior to Chinese weapons made from bronze and bamboo. For 3 years, the British attacked almost at will, their steam-powered vessels enabling them to travel anywhere that could be reached by water. The British military made use of these, the same machines that made the English factories the most productive in the world, and the British Army and Navy the most feared force anywhere in Asia. The ultimate irony was that the Chinese, inventors of gunpowder, were defeated when foreigners turned their superior cannon against them. In the Treaty of Nanjing, the Chinese were compelled to pay an indemnity of $21 million and to open 5 European-controlled treaty ports for the China trade. Qianlong's boasts of self-sufficiency, Kangxi's sniff of superior knowledge, these were to be blown away again and again over the next decades by the cannon that a handful of outside barbarians had brought halfway around the world. What was striking was that up until the point of war, the Chinese didn't understand that they were losing the race, didn't even see that there was a race to be run. Yet in the 300 years since the Jesuits had first tried to convert the emperor with a little bit of science and the word of God, a Europe vastly different from the one that the Jesuits portrayed to the Chinese had emerged. Confucian priorities remained at odds with those of the European powers, but the foreign barbarians the Chinese once scorned now flew their flags over Chinese cities. The power the West brought to bear presented the Chinese with an inescapable dilemma: how to respond to the Western idea of progress, to learn enough about modern science and technology to defend themselves, yet remain Chinese. The answers to this question were to consume some of the best minds of China for decades. In some measure, they still do. Next time on Nova. At the heart of this debate were guns.
Conservatives in the Qing court said there was nothing wrong with Chinese civilization. We need a few more guns. But essentially, it's our own confidence in our values that will save us. The reformers were a little bit more practical and said that the guns are actually more important.
Japan asked different questions, and its success in mastering the Western science of war created the threat from Japan. That's next time on The Genius That Was China.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.
This is PBS.